record. And then we'll go ahead and broadcast. We'll give it a few minutes while folks are joining us. Usually takes a couple minutes for folks to get into Zoom. Okay, good evening or good afternoon or good night, depending on where you're logging in from. Welcome to our live online event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight, and we are thrilled to host this event with Ben Okri presenting his new book, Prayer for the Living. He'll be talking with Porochista Khakpour, so you are in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Ben, to Porochista, and to the team at Akashic Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here, and we're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. A couple little housekeeping things before we start. In our Zoom webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have specific questions you'd like to have answered by the author, please post those in the Q&A module. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Prayer for the Living, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person at our bookstore locations in Brooklyn, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week. And you can purchase Ben's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat in a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening. Our interviewer is Porochista Khakpour. Born in Tehran and raised in the Los Angeles area, she currently lives in New York City. She's the author of the novels Suns and Other Flammable Objects and The Last Illusion, and the memoir Sick, and most recently of the essay collection Brown Album, Essays on Exile and Identity, which just came out last May. Her nonfiction has appeared in many sections of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Elle, Slate, Salon, and Book Forum, among many others. She's been guest faculty at VCFA and Stone Coast MFA programs, as well as contributing editor at Evergreen Review. Among her many fellowships is a National Endowment for the Arts Award. She's going to be speaking tonight with our featured author, Ben Okri. He was born in Minna, Nigeria, and his childhood was divided between Nigeria, where he saw firsthand the consequences of war, and London. He's the author of numerous works of fiction, including The Famished Road, which won the Booker Prize. His most recent novel, The Freedom Artist, was published last February, also by Akashic Books. His work has been translated into more than 25 languages. He also writes plays and screenplays. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a vice president of English Pen, and has been awarded the OBE, as well as numerous international prizes and honorary doctorates. His new book, Prayer for the Living, which I'm lucky enough to have a copy of, is a timely new collection of stories from a writer at the height of his power. It's playful, it's frightening, it's actually shocking. Each one of these 24 stories is going to make you wonder if what you see in the world can really be all there is. So Ben is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he's going to be talking with Porochista and then with all of you. So Ben, please take it away. And don't forget to unmute.
I first of all want to say what a pleasure it is to be here and there in conversation with you all in these very strange times. And it's also a special pleasure to be in conversation with Porochista, whose essays I've been reading recently and find very powerful and fascinating. And I want to extend a kind of warm greeting to everybody out there. It's amazing that we can make this connection. So I want to celebrate Greenlight Bookstore for doing this. We're going to be talking about Prayer for the Living. My first collection of stories in more than 10, 12 years. And I'm going to read one of the shorter stories from this book. This one is very short, and it's at the beginning of the book. It's by no means characteristic of the whole work, but it's the shortest one, and it's I think this is a good way to meet. It's called Boko Haram 1. They strapped the bomb around his chest and buttoned up his shirt. His father was with them. When the boy looked up at him, his father smiled. Together, they recited the words of the prophet. The father stood there and watched as they led the boy away. He prayed that the boy would be brave and would do what he had been told. He knew the rewards in paradise were great. He could see the rewards already. At the marketplace, they let the boy go. He wandered a few steps and looked back. They stared at him brightly. Then he walked unsteadily past the fish sellers and the cloth merchants and the women who sold provisions on a cloth on the floor. Some of them knew him and called out to him, but he went on walking. He looked steadily ahead. Sweat formed in beads on his forehead. He went to the center of the marketplace where it was busiest. As he walked, he recited the words they had taught him. They were not words from the Quran. They were words given to him by men from the sect. He recited the words in the heat and noise of the market. Then he stood in the center and waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. They had only told him that when he was in the center of the marketplace, he was to wait. He was not to look at anyone. He was not to speak to anyone. He was only to recite under his breath the words he had been given. He did not know about the scattered fragments of limbs and the ripped earth as the bomb tore up the marketplace. He did not know about it because he was still saying the words he had been given when it exploded.
Wow, I am so happy that you read that, and it's such a moving part of it. I want to just say thank you so much for allowing me to be in conversation with you. I was so honored when Akashik asked me to do this, because you've been one of my favorite writers forever, and I had a great honor about 5 years ago when Barnes & Noble contacted me, and it was just sort of like brilliant that they could make that connection. And they wrote to me and they said they were doing a special, it was the anniversary of their like great writers program. I forget the name of it. And they were basically honoring like the greatest writers of like the 20th century. And they wanted different writers to write about authors that had meant a lot to them. And so without me even mentioning it, they could tell that I would be a fan of yours. So they said, have you read The Famished Road by Ben Okri? I said, of course I have. And they were like, well, would you like to do that one? Would you like to write the Ben Okri essay? And I was like, oh my gosh, of course. But I was extremely intimidated and extremely anxious. I still remember I wrote it over the course of a late spring summer. And I was so worried about getting it right. But, you know, given I have had a career of writing nonfiction and fiction, but for me, really, the magical in fiction has been very important, really what I would call more fabulism. And I feel like you've really taught me how to do that. And I was really reminded of that when I was looking through Prayer for the Living again, how much one can learn and what it really means. I mean, I come from such a different background, being Iranian American, but there's so much that for me also makes sense here, the incorporation of myth, the living with the sort of poles of the familiar and the unfamiliar. I kept thinking about that as I was reading this. And, you know, even like Boko Haram and the way that like something that is so surreal can exist in the real world, right? You have these the marketplace, right? And the boys walking through it. And you have these men who are basically saying prayers and like owing their life to the work of like the godly and the divine. And at the same time, there's like horrific atrocity and murder and all that. And so much of that feels so real to me culturally. So I just want to thank you. And I just feel so honored. And this book is so tremendous. I really hope that everyone will read it. It's just, there's so much there. It's one of the richest reading experiences you can have because these stories are so diverse, but also clearly from the same brilliant author. There's so much that writers can learn from here too. So I just found it so instructive. I wanted to ask you first, because I don't know this feeling yet. You know, I'm on my 5th book, but I kept seeing in both Akashic's literature and a lot of the reviews that have just come out, because it's just come out very recently, the people kept saying it's like a career-spanning story collection. I kept hearing the word career-spanning, and for some reason it made me a little bit anxious. Like I imagined if someone were to be like telling me like I was doing a career. I'm working on my first short story collection actually right now, but it's like, it's such a heavy term. And I was just wondering, was that something you were thinking of when you were putting this together? Like your whole life? Like, I don't know, what goes into like constructing a book like this at this point in your career?
That's a great question, Porochista. The thing is, I haven't published that many volumes of stories, and when I do, for me, it's a special event because I never think of it as just a collection of stories. For me, all the stories have to link in some way. They have to speak to one another. They have to resonate with one another. They have to amplify one another. Sometimes they even have to play with one another. And it just takes a long time to have stories that cohere, that come together and form a universe. So with something like this, I had to wait a long time. I had some of the stories go back 30 years. I mean, the one I just read to you was published about 25, 26 years ago. And some of them are very, very, very recent. Some of them I've just had and polished and turned over and shaped. So this one, the one I read out to you, has been published before, twice. And it's got altered each time. Over the years, it's got more compressed. I don't mean the one I just read. I mean the title story, Playful Living itself, is the oldest. So when they say career spanning, I know what they mean, but it doesn't really reflect all aspects of my short story writing because there's a lot that's not published yet. There's a lot I've not put into a book form. But for me, with this book, I wanted all the stories to come together under the theme of prayer, under the theme of prayer for the living, because of the circumstances of the world in which we find ourselves right now. And I feel this is a time when we really need prayer more than any other. There's so much going on in the world, so many atrocities, so much sadness, so many deaths, so much injustice, national injustice, police injustice, police brutality, climate troubles. I mean, you name it. I really feel that we are right now as a human race and kind of like the last chance saloon of our great narrative. I really think we're on the very, very edge of the end of our days if we don't do something extraordinary, an act of imagination, an act of heart, an act of spirit, so great that we can turn this ship around. We can turn this possible disaster of the human race around. That's where we are right now. We need prayer. We need awakening. We need vision. We need voices crying out. We need people to stop being citizens and become activists. We need everybody to join in this big moment to turn our world around and make it as beautiful and as livable as it ought to have been. Give our children some kind of hope for a future. So they cohere around the theme of the fact that we, the living, normally it's the dead that need the prayers of the living, but right now we, the living, need the prayers of the living and the dead. You know, we're holding the bowl of the future in our hands, and it's very, very, very fragile.
Yeah, it's actually something that really stuck out to me is how much in this book the dead almost seem okay. the dead are very animate and they're going through their like narratives and they almost seem well taken care of. It almost seems like we're requiring the dead to pray for us.
Yeah.
Because the jeopardy in this book to me is all like the living. And I really, really hear what you're saying. I just had recently the very weird experience. I think it happens with every new generation. A very young interviewer was asking me, do I consider my work political? And do I think like writing should be political? And I was almost irritated because I just thought it was just a shocking question to ask. I was like, how can you even like, are you awake? How can you ask that? Of course, everything is political. Like, how could it not be? And then I realized, I tried to, not get too grumpy and to understand that like, when you first come to the arts, maybe there is this idea that you can write in a vacuum or that there is an escapism that's a possible road for the artist. But I think I feel what you're feeling. And I think a lot of writers become writers because they felt this for a while, like we are headed towards a real reckoning. And I think what I really admired, though, is that your ability to make things really political and still have that activist spirit, but it doesn't feel like it. Like when I'm reading your stories, I don't know how you quite do it, actually. It doesn't feel like I'm being told like how to think of something or what side. In a way, even like, you're I'm even thinking of the Boko Haram section. So it's not like you humanize Boko Haram, but it's like, I can see every lens at one time. You're very good at a certain simultaneity, which is really difficult to do, I think, as a writer. So actually, that was a question I also had too, is like, how do we as writers like encompass the world like this? Like I have so many questions about your process. Like when you come to an idea, and there's so many here, like we said, how does it work? Like say something in the news. I was mentioning to you before, like a wonderful essay you wrote that I think everyone should read that came out in The Guardian this summer about George Floyd and that sentence, I can't breathe. And you really dissect that sentence brilliantly and why I can't breathe is such an important sentence on so many levels. And I just wondered if you could talk about this idea of the political and being an activist writer and like how that involves like your process also like aesthetically. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I find it astonishing when people ask about whether one is a political writer or not. But on the other hand, I think one has to. I don't want to speak for other writers. I think it's unwise to do that. Let me speak for myself. My desire, my dream, my goal, what I've always aspired to and fought for and struggled for, is to speak about life as one experiences it on all of its dimensions, simply as it is here. That's the most difficult thing. I mean, first of all, the first difficulty is actually to experience our experiences. I mean, just to actually be in our bodies and to experience every moment what we're experiencing itself is, to paraphrase T.S. Eliot, the work of a lifetime. We're often asleep to ourselves, asleep to our experiences, asleep to our pains, to our failures, our difficulties, our successes. We just half sleepwalk through life. So to actually be present and be aware and to actually see what we're seeing in itself as a human being is already difficult enough. To do that as a writer and then find the technique to capture that as a writer in a story, which is not a piece of reporting, is another intensification of that technique, which takes a long time. But these are the things I've been striving for. I've always wanted my stories to be human, to be beautiful, to be true, to be political, to be shaped, to be mysterious, to be spiritual. I want them to touch all of these levels. I want not because I want to kind of like tick boxes, but because for me, life at any moment is all of those things at once, at the same time. They're not. We don't swing from one political moment to a non-political moment, or one aesthetic moment to a non-aesthetic moment. It's all here. It's all mingled in. It's all part of the mystery and magic and complexity and simplicity of living. The difficulty is finding the art, distilling the art by which one can tell stories that captures all of these things. It's a real, it's for me that's always been from my earliest books, Flowers and Shadows, which I wrote when I was 17, 18. That's what I've always been striving for. And it's very, very, at first it led me towards a kind of a magnification of my art. It made me into a writer that used a lot of words, poetic, a kind of poetic writer. But then I realized with the passing of time that actually the visible poetry actually gets in the way of the lived experience. Whether it's the visible poetry that one brings to life or the visible poetry that one brings to one's writing. And you know, it's all the really great writers I admire are people who can dissolve. They dissolve all the complexities of things in the simplicity of a touch. And that for me has always been the highest sign of mastery. Complexity I can do. I think complexity is easy. Poetry is not that difficult. What is difficult is truth on all its levels at once.
Yeah, I can feel like that in your work so much. I can feel it's something you do so well. Do you feel like you're drawn more to longer forms or short forms? This is a question I always ask writers, and I know myself, like it's much easier for me to write a novel actually than it sometimes takes me 10 years to write a single short story, but I can usually write a draft of a novel in 6 months. That's my rhythm. But I'm in awe of short stories. I think they're the most magical form. And I just really, it's very hard for me to do. Do you feel like one or the other is more home for you?
Poetry is more home for me. Poetry is where I began. Poetry is where I go when I'm lost. Poetry is when I go when I'm happy. Poetry is where I go when I'm trying to make sense of life and love and the mystery of things. And poetry helps me dissolve into prose. Poetry is the core for me. And poetry is, I don't use poetry in the sense of, again, the high flown. It's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of distilling one's experience. It is a kind of a magic way of touching so many things at the same time. Because we are connected to so many things at the same time. And now to go back to what you were saying about the short form and the long form, I think the short story is the most difficult prose form, full stop.
I do.
And maybe after the sonnet, one of the most difficult things to write well. Because to write brief is not really writing brief. A short story is not a novel that was aborted, or a novel that didn't become a novel. A short story is a complete universe. It's a complete world in itself. And every single sentence, every cut that you make of the short story is a fragment and a moment of that world. The whole thing has to cohere from the very first sentence. Even the punctuation is part of the way that world is created. It's much more difficult to create small, much harder to create a flea than it is to create a planet. The thing about big things, the thing about the novel is that it has its own momentum. It has its own, there's a certain additive, a certain additional quality to the novel. There's a way in which you have a character, and you can just have a whole page of dialogue that goes on pages after pages. Description can take you in all sorts of places. With the short story, you can't do that. Everything has to justify its place in that universe. It's harder to be brief. I've found with many of the stories in this volume, the ones I've had for years, sometimes it took 5-10 years to actually know how to end them. I had everything else, but how to end them. In some cases, how to start the damn things. You know, just the opening sentence can sometimes take me either in one moment or 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. Until I get those things right, there's really no point putting them into a book.
Yeah, I can feel that meticulousness, and I'm so glad you also feel that way, because I just find it like every time I read a great short story, I pause and I just think like, how did that come into being? Whereas when I read a novel, I can see the skeleton very clearly. I can graph and chart any novel, but short stories, you know, if I pick up the New Yorker right now and read a short story there, I generally find it so mysterious how they came about. So
there are few perfect novels, but there are quite a few perfect short stories.
I agree. Yeah, I'm so inspired by them. I want to remind people, by the way, too, you can put questions in the Q&A. We will get to them, but I'm so excited that I have you here because I have so many questions that really I'm dying to ask. There's one that's really dear to me that I thought of a lot 5 years ago when I was writing the essay on Famished Road, and you really helped me I was at a real breaking point where I was getting so sick of this feeling of being pigeonholed, and I really felt that people were only reading my work for anthropological insights about Iranianness. And I was just like really about to be like, I need to like leave this planet. Like, I can't do this anymore. It was really upsetting because then I'd go to other readings and like white writers would get asked about like art and like themes and things like that and aesthetics. And it was like so beautiful. And meanwhile, I had to just explain like women in veils and like, you know, various aspects of like my culture. So you had a great quote about this that I really thought was interesting. You said, an anomaly of perception is often brought to Black and African writers. They tend to be considered only important to their subjects. We read Flaubert for beauty, Joyce for innovation, Virginia Woolf for poetry, Jane Austen for psychology. But Black and African writers are read for their novels about slavery, colonialism, poverty, civil wars, imprisonment, female circumcision. In short, for subjects that reflect the troubles of Africa and Black people as perceived by the rest of the world. They are defined by their subjects. And maybe it is those in the West whose lives are untouched by such suffering who find occasional spice and flirtation with such a literature. That really hit me hard because I also see that with my own culture, and my role is always this like Iranian American, always this hyphenated writer. And at the same time, I'm also very defensive, and I love being Iranian. And so like, I don't want that taken away from me either. I don't want someone to think I'm ashamed, or I just want to be seen as American, God forbid. So it's a real dilemma. So I've always wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit on this now on this book too, which both deals with like Africanness, but also zooms out of it at times too. You're so good at being universal, but also specific at once too. And I don't know. I guess I'm just asking you to riff on this because it's such a dilemma for me every single day that I write.
Porochista, it really does depend on how you see yourself. Are you a writer? Are you a writer as a human being? Are you a human being in this world, experiencing your life only through your Iranianness? Is every aspect of your experience linked only to the fact that I'm Nigerian? Or am I a human being who's also interested in rhinos and butterflies, in cloud formations and acts of terrorism, in the political condition of America and the police brutalities in Nigeria, as well as the latest novels and most beautiful plays and works of art that's come about, children's dresses, children's songs, snowflakes and sunlight on the wall. It depends. It depends on, finally, it comes down to one, how you define yourself, two, how you respond to the definition of yourself by others as a human being and as a writer. So that's I think each writer has to make up his or her own aesthetic and artistic identity. For me, the most important thing is being human. And what happens to human beings everywhere affects me and moves me and resonates me and shakes me and inspires me. Having said that, I'm also a Black African living in London. So I'm in profound sympathy with what happens to Black people in England, what happens to Black people all over the world. But that's not just my experience. My experience is broader than all of that. And I've struggled with this for a long time. For the early parts of my writing life, you were supposed to be only an African writer. Then you come to London. And how can you go on being just an African writer when you're also experiencing stuff in London that is just outside that Africanness, or at least has expanded that Africanness? What do you do about the expansion that life has brought to you? Do you refuse it? Do you shut the door on your life? Even when I was in Nigeria, do you shut the door? Do you say, I can only experience my world from my national definition? And I think all of these things have a tremendous impact on the nature of our creations, on the freedom of our art. for me, I start with the human. I start with the human, and I follow my loves. I follow my pain and my loves, my suffering, my joys, my imaginings. I love playfulness, and the fact that someone can come along and say to me that you're Black and African and you can only write about these sorts of things. These are the only things that we'll take seriously from you, and that you're only allowed to write about, seems to me to be a kind of imprisonment, and worse than that, actually a kind of literary fascism, if you don't mind my saying so. Nobody on this freaking planet has the right to tell me what I can write about as a human being, from my aesthetics, from my intelligence, from my emotion, from my playfulness, from my humanity. Nobody has the right to tell me what I can dream about. But you know, I am drawn to the pain of my people, because it's something that one wants to draw attention to, because I'm also a deeply political writer who wants to help change the circumstances that I find in this world. So I feel your wrestling, Porochista, very much. But I want to say to you, you're on the right track. You know, you love your Iranianness, but you don't want to be defined only by it, and you shouldn't be, because I mean, just one look at you, I can tell that you're many things. You're a subversive person. You're a person of joy. You're a person who likes to surprise themselves. You're someone who explores. You're someone who is wayward, and maybe even a little bloody-minded, which all genuine artists are. And that is what makes our art. That's what makes our art rich. So when we bring all of this passion, this wonder, this boundlessness to whatever subject that we care about, we are bringing much more than the narrow squirt of the expected emotion that we're supposed to bring to it. We are bringing a world. We're bringing a vast force, and I think that's how we should be as writers. So that when we turn our hearts in a certain direction, it's felt with the fullness of our being.
I love that. It's really funny. I actually almost alienated an editor a little while back because they said they were off-put by my use of humor, which is really in all my books. It's like part of how I see the world. And they said, oh, well, maybe it's just not translating right. Maybe it's like an Iranian humor. It's a little dark. The dark humor is, I don't think, what they're looking for when they're looking for your work, because, we want the weight of things, the seriousness. And I realized really, as they kept on talking, that they really wanted a certain sort of poverty porn that was from the Middle East, that they were used to. And so the third world for them is always a world of suffering. And as long as I was writing in a mode of suffering, it was clean. And
you were recognized and visible. Yeah. But you see, the thing that a lot of these people don't understand is that the so-called third world is also a place, of tremendous laughter and humor. You need to check out a booker in Lagos. Wander into any of the palm wine joints, and I promise you would not see people being somber over their glasses of palm wine. You will hear boisterous laughter and jokes and jousts with words and spiritedness. So you'll be, it just simply would not square with your idea of what the so-called third world is. So, yeah, even that idea of how we are in our homes and in our lives is a very limited perception. And I think many writers, if we're not careful, internalize that and actually limit even the reflection of the range of humanity and spirit and playfulness and joy and suffering and pain and all of that's present at the same time in the lives of our people.
Yeah,
so
huge.
So yeah. So I'm a great believer in opening our lenses. We need to open our lens. We need to open our hearts and open our craft.
I have this battle sometimes with book covers where they want to do in this very Orientalist script that to them seems recognizably ethnic. And it's like, no, I want whatever treatment you're going to give, like, whatever white weight, or like if it's just going to be a gorgeous font that seems appropriate, let's go with that. You don't have to I don't know. It's just it's just very funny. And I hope that, yeah.
I've spent 40 years, 40 years of a writing life fighting covers.
Yeah, that's
the number of masks, the number of African sculptors I've had to bat off the covers of my books. You would not believe it. Time after time, you win the Booker Prize, and they still do it. Every time I have to have a call with my publishers and say to them, no masks on my covers, please.
Wow.
There's no need to put drums on my covers. There's no need for it. There's so much you can do. You can get away from so much of that ethnographic limitation of the lives of people in Lagos or in Iran.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It's really, I feel very embarrassed for them, actually, because again, it shows you the sort of provinciality of the West. We were exposed to so much of the world, I feel like, in our education, how we saw the world, but actually so much of the West only looks at the West. So when they have the other, they're reduced to just stereotypes, and they don't know how else to market them. And it's just like, I feel so embarrassed, but I'm always the biggest pain in the ass when it comes to covers, because
Porochista, I also think it's our responsibility as writers to educate the world into the richness of how we can be seen. I think often we acquiesce too easily because we don't want to be difficult, and we don't want to upset the perceptions that people have, and often we're very grateful to be published, and we just accept, and that acceptance then creates a whole pattern of presentation for the generation that comes afterwards, and it gets perpetuated by each generation not being bloody-minded and difficult about it, because finally it comes down to how you are being defined. It comes down to how you're being reflected back to yourself as a human being, and we have to in our writing, we have to in our personality, in our speech, in our thought, we have to constantly challenge the limitation into which we're constantly imprisoned.
So well put. You're absolutely right. It's a really important reminder. I'm kind of dipping into some of these questions. We're already getting some really amazing ones. Someone is asking, while we're on this topic, because of the identities that are imposed on you, have you ever self-censored in your work? How does one avoid self-censorship? This is an incredible.
It's the hardest thing.
Avoid self-censorship.
Yeah, it's very, very hard. When you're beginning as a writer, the self-censorship that you're talking about already has often already been part of the thinking of your generation. It's already there before you start writing. It's not something that you do to yourself when you start writing your first short story or novel or poem. It's already happening in your mind before you've actually got to that point. And so for me, writing, the act of writing, the process of writing, all that goes into writing, the thinking, the turning things over, ought to be the place in which we confront all of these limitations and ideas with which we're imprisoned before we enter the stage of our possibility. It's too late a question to ask when you're in mid-career, in the early parts of your career. How do I escape? It's already too late, because it's already part of your hands. Let me show you my hands, people. It's already in your hands before you've actually got there. So how you escape it? I think you have to ask all the questions. Who am I? What am I? What is the world telling me that I should be? What is the world expecting from me? What does the world praise me for having done? What does the world reject me for having done? Where are the awkward edges of my art as it relates to the world? It's a very, this self-censorship, external literary censorship is a very, very, very subtle thing, and actually takes the form, the most powerful form of all, which is the form of acceptance. The essay you read out earlier, a lot of African writers took issue with me because I think they misunderstood what I was trying to say, and also because, if I'm really, really honest, because the headline of the piece was not written by me. Again, this is a case of the on freedom in which we find ourselves. I wrote this essay. I had my own title for it. But when it was published, another title was put on it, and that was all people saw. You know, the level of our freedoms, the level of the power that we have to actually say, no, that's not what I mean. This is what I mean, is part of the struggle of being a writer. So we have to question how we accept it. We have to question the subjects that we choose to write about. In this particular volume, I've written 3 times about Boko Haram, not because I felt I had to write about it, but because of the difficulty of doing it. The difficulty of writing about the subject that actually is full of pain and does not actually reflect very well on you, but you have to say it because these things have to be dealt with and healed. So one shouldn't be afraid to look at the awkward things about oneself, about where we are. But one should neither be afraid to leap out of that.
Yeah.
Leap to the stars.
I think that's
leap to dreams without definitions.
Yeah.
Sometimes write without a point. To sometimes, you know, I mean, I read something that Flaubert said that really astounded me when I was in my 20s. And I think he was talking about one of his novels, and he said, I didn't want it to be about anything. And I was, wow, this is me coming from a tradition where, as a writer, you had to be a social conscience. As a writer, you had to be the fifth estate. You had to take the government to task. And here is this French writer in the 19th century, when France is certainly not perfect. You know, it's full of its ghettos and full of the poor and full of the starving. And Hugo was writing Les Miserables at roughly the same time about great poverty. And here he is saying, I wanted my novel that I'm spending 5 years polishing to be about nothing. And I was like, whoa, that is what an extraordinary freedom. But of course, it's not about nothing. It can never be about nothing. But just that you can take that freedom too, I think, is part of the important power of our art.
It's so important for people to hear that. I think that's so empowering, because I think people do feel helpless sometimes. And that's where that self-censoring comes in. It's so toxic. It's really important to battle that demon. Another great question. Again, if you put them in the Q&A, it's easier than the chat. So I'm looking in there. Amina writes, could you speak to how the way we experience art might have changed now that we are more physically isolated? How has the way you consume other forms of art changed during this pandemic? It's a former students of yours here, and we recall a memory from Florence in 2012 when you were teaching the NYU summer program, and we were exploring the Duomo Baptistery, and you asked us to lie down and look up at the mosaics on the ceiling. Oh, beautiful.
Wow. Yeah. Bless you. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I remember Florence with a shiver of pleasure and happiness, and from the pandemic, almost like a dream that never happened. You can't consume art in a pandemic. We're locked away from it. You can go to virtual galleries online, but a painting on a screen comes nowhere close to a painting on a wall. Because the thing about art, whether it's an installation, whether it's a David Hammons or whether it's a Van Gogh, is the tactility, the unbelievable reality of its existence, of the fact that these isolated brushstrokes from a certain distance away coheres into this unique vision of the universe, the unique vision of a field or of a face. And it's done with these isolated brushstrokes, these pigments, these brushstrokes of different sizes. And it's just looking at the detail of this, the magical pixelation of art, the detail of this, and pulling back to see the vision that's created. That's we're left with dreams, and we're left with dreams and shadows. Plays you read. I love reading play scripts, but plays are meant to be experienced. You're meant to almost see the spit of the actor flying across the air as they perform their soliloquies. It's the living quality of most art that is so powerful. So I think what we're left with is the memory and the longing, the nostalgia, the desire, the ache. I think the pandemic has deepened our sense of the value of art, of the necessity of art. You know, it was always put in a kind of a category outside of necessity. It was always marginalized as an extra of life. Actually, it is one of the things that helps us to live. It is one of the things that helps us to be human. If we just have an economy, we would still be barbarians. I want to stress that. If we just have an economy, we would still be freaking barbarians. You know, the building of spaceships is directly related to the carving of sentences and verses, whether it's by Dante or Kibo or Shakespeare. There is a direct correlation between our great scientific achievements and our literary imagination. It comes from the same well, it comes from the same source. The freedom achieved in one area opens up freedoms in other areas. You cannot separate these things. I think because we're turned in on ourselves, we are beginning to realize just how expansive we are, how vast we are as human beings. And I hope that we come out of this pandemic different. I hope we don't go back to what we were. What we were wasn't good enough. It was screwing up the planet. We're killing ourselves. We're killing ourselves with injustices. We need to go to a new future. We need to go to a new possibility. We need to come out different. Otherwise, all of this year that we've spent would have been wasted.
Yeah, it really feels like a parable where like the gods would tell you like, oh, you know, well, here you are, here's this huge disaster. And then human beings are like, well, we know how to do this. We have technology. That's the answer. We'll be fine. And then it's just been so amazing to watch, like, you know, even me at the early part of the pandemic, I thought, oh, I've had experience being chronically ill. I know how to be at home. And as a writer, I'll just work. And it's like every month that went by, it was like I eroded in different ways. And it just got more and more difficult. And it's like, yeah, I really also hope we never, ever go back to where we were, because this is a very big lesson for all of humanity. And I don't think many people in their lifetimes really go through something like this. So it's huge.
Yeah.
We have several interesting questions still. I love the questions that are coming up. Here's a simple one. What are some short story writers that you admire?
Oh goodness.
That's actually loaded too.
It's a long list.
Yeah.
So many. Where do I start? Chekhov. Catherine Mansfield. Flannery O'Connor, Truman Capote, V.S. Pritchett. Ngugi wrote quite a few lovely short stories, wonderful short stories. And Ngugi Achebe wrote just one volume. I kind of regret that he didn't write more. Girls at War, lovely, beautiful short stories. Wow. I love Melville's late stories. Turgenev's short stories. You know, the short story has come from people who've had a magazine tradition for a long time. So in a sense, when I give a list, it would be kind of weighted towards the West because they just simply had. You can't write short stories if you don't have a magazine tradition. It's as simple as that. Nobody really writes short stories at the beginning to put in books. Maybe the oldest short stories were tales and fables in a way, but they don't count in quite the same way. So we're going to have to go to the 18th century, 17th century. Jane Austen didn't write many short stories herself. Hardy did, but not that many. There has to be a tradition that supports it. And not newspapers, magazines. And magazines are kind of 18th, 19th century creations. Who are the really great short story writers? Chekhov has to be one of the most magnificent. I love Pushkin's short stories. He didn't write many, but the few that he wrote are exceptional. And in the class that I taught in Florence, and I don't do much teaching, I often spoke to them about the story that I think is maybe one of the greatest short stories ever written, and it's a story by Pushkin. I often talked about the opening of that story. I mean, I talk about the opening of stories a lot. Do you have any favorite openings yourself of stories, Porochista?
So, short stories for me, I have the same issue that you have, because it also is a sort of an almost exotic form for me too, because in Iranian culture, we mostly have poetry or longer forms. And so, yeah, I end up having a lot of Western influences too. I tend to, I like a lot of the 20th century, like I love like James Salter's short stories. I really like, because they're really strange and also just like very like sensual, but in a very dark way that's like, I really can't do myself. And I love like, of course, Borges's, I love all the
Oh boy, yes, Borges is wonderful. Yes, yeah, wonderful.
Those guys, I love that stuff.
Marquez wrote some wonderful early short stories. And in many ways of the body of his works, I favor his short stories, those early ones, because of the brevity, because he was learning this difficult art. There's a short story of his called Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon, which begins with a sentence which I could give a seminar about. The cage was finished. Often love that. The cage was finished. Fitzgerald was a wonderful short story writer.
Nabokov.
Good old Fitz. Nabokov, yes, yeah.
I really love when you can see his Russian stories versus his like English ones.
His American stories.
Yeah, they're really interesting. I keep thinking of a story of his called Wingstroke that no one reads, that I think was originally in Russian. It's like the most haunting short story I've ever read, and no one really knows what it means, but it's like so bizarre, full of angels and like weird, like fabulous conceits in a very ordinary landscape. It's just incredible. Someone actually asked a question that might piggyback on this in a good way, because they were asking about the variety of your stories, which really, even just hearing you talk about short story writers, I mean, as a human, you are so varied in your tastes. And so this also occurred to me when I was reading this, just even locations, right? This person is asking about Byzantium, Peru. You have all these, like, this variety of presumably settings here. You have Istanbul, New York, you have Machu Picchu, you have so much going on. So I'm assuming their question is like, how and why do you grasp for, like, what are all your influences and how do they manifest in the stories like that? Because there is a way in which a lot of short story collections kind of hover in one setting, or they have a limited scope, but I never feel that way with yours.
Yeah, but there's an advantage to that. I mean, I get that. You take something like Dubliners, where all the stories are set in one city, and you get to look at it's a portrait of a city through 15 different characters. I love that because it gives the unity of tone. Unity of tone is a wonderful thing to be able to work in a book of stories. But I also like diversity of tone with unity of spirit. I think that's terrific too. And that's such a challenge, and to see different things out of the same spirit, the same lens, is just as unifying as to see what, as to look at one place. I tell you why I like diversity and different settings. It's because it actually compels my tone to be different. And also because the stories, I'm first of all drawn to strange tales, to things I've experienced or thought about or glimpsed, or conjectures. I'm very much a concept. Sometimes I'm a conceptual short story writer. I like to take an idea and then humanize it, give it embodiment, and see what the implications of that might be. I mean, there's a story called "Alternative Varieties Are True," in which I explore quantum, the possibilities of a thriller in a quantum universe. And that for me was a thought experiment. I was just fascinated by the possibility of that. How do you do that? How do you actually make that work? How do you take a quantum idea and fuse it into the thriller tradition? I was just fascinated by bringing these diverse elements together. So it's also fascination. You know, sometimes they're just stories, but sometimes they're fascinations and they're paradoxes. And I find everything I write, all my secret passions come into it. All the secret politics comes into it. I always prefer when the things I care about the most come into the things I'm writing indirectly. I always think it's much truer than when I set about and roll up my sleeves and say, okay, right now I'm going to tell you a story about a Nigerian marketplace. I'm going to make you feel it and live it. When I start to do that, I get bored. Because I'm conscious of the fact that I'm trying to work this effect on people. I like being taken by surprise and taken on a journey. And many of the stories here, they're prayers, the prayer for the living, but it's also play. It's also playing for the living.
Oh, love that. Yeah, I love the idea of the journey too for the writer themselves. I think it's infectious. This kind of piggybacks a little bit on that too. Maybe we have time for 2 more of these great questions here. Do you consciously employ metaphor in your stories, or is it created in the mind of the reader? For example, in your story Hail and Prayer for the Living, set in a frame shop, I perceived it as various ways to frame reality by the protagonist. Did you intend that?
That's a good reading. And thank you, whoever you are, for picking Hail. It's a story that a lot of the readers of this book just thought was like a throwaway story. Actually, it's one of the central stories in the book. It's about, apparently, like Flaubert, it's apparently about nothing. But is it really about nothing, or is it a story about love? Is it a story about? Am I playing on what hail means? And what is hail? This condensation, this thing that is neither ice nor water, neither air nor, and then the frame, because the whole thing takes place, and they're standing at the window, and the world is framed. And what is framing anyway? What is a frame? Where does the frame of anything? When we stand in real life, our frame is the edge of our vision. Is the limit of our vision is our frame, but our mental frame is the edges of our prejudices, the ideas that we are capable of thinking, the possibilities we're capable of exploring. So there are many different kinds of frames in that story. And so, no, was I consciously creating metaphors? No, I was telling a story, and I was shaping a story from the inside. And wanting the words to be as transparent and as translucent and as clear and as true and as poetic at the same time as possible. But I always like this. I always like the camera lens to be ambiguous. I like ambiguity of tone. I think stories are much more powerful when the tone, you can't quite put your finger on what the tone is. Is it a tone angry? Is it a wonder tone? Is it an ironic tone? I always like ambiguity of tone, because then when you read, you're reading you're reading with your nerves, because you don't know what you're supposed to be feeling. You're much more open. I love openness in a reader. I think too many books make us closed. But openness, when we're open and tingly with possibilities, I think the whole human being comes into the reading. It's for me, it's how I've always read, and the things I go back to do exactly that to me.
It's almost like sometimes fun to follow those threads where you're even not sure the ambiguity is even there for yourself as the creator, and you just follow the mystery of it, and it's so I love that. Another wonderful question here. Really good questions in this reading.
Wow. Wow. We have an intelligent audience.
You have good readers.
Yay.
Great.
Yay.
So, Ben, I'm interested in your thoughts on debates on appropriation of voice. As writers, if we're not to be stuck talking about only ourselves and our narrow experiences, then we need to imagine the lives, experiences, and voices of others. And yet, particularly those of us living in positions of relative privilege and relative social power have challenges seeing beyond our universe. For me, part of the answer is careful, respectful listening, but also challenging our own assumptions in the world.
Yeah, you've answered your own question. Absolutely. I think it comes down to respect. It comes down to I think the age is long gone when you can be a tourist writer, where you can just be white and travel to Nigeria, travel to Lagos, hang around for a couple of days, and then write stories based there, and on the absolute assumption that no one will challenge it. I think those days are over. I'm not against journeys into other people's lives, but it has to be done with the greatest respect, and with love, with rigor, with understanding, and with accreditation. You have to be honest about what it is that you're doing. Your hands have to be clear and clean. I kind of had a principle when I was much younger, which I still keep to, that I will try not to write about any characters whose childhoods I can't imagine. And it's really that. If you can't go into the secret of people's living rooms, if you can't go into their childhoods, if you can't go into what it is that they suffered, what it is that they survived, if you can't smell it, and you're just kind of guessing from a distance, what are you doing there? I'm not saying you can't do it, but you have to make that journey. You have to make that journey, and you have to shed your skin. You have to shed your assumptions. You have to shed your privileges. No one is saying you can't come to a village, but you have to get rid of your fur coat. Come to the village. Come up to people's levels, because it's not a going down; it's a coming up. Wherever you are, wherever else you're going, it's a coming up, because you're coming out of yourself up into someone else's life, up into someone else's possibility. It's an up. Whether they're poorer than you or richer than you, it's an up. So you need to there's too much mental privilege. There's just, people talk about privilege, as if it's just a financial, economic thing. The worst part of it is it's a mental thing, because it's so many areas of thought that have not been challenged. And in many cases, actually, because of the power structures of today, not really challengeable. Many of us, Porochista, many of us can't just, seize the pages of a newspaper and challenge many of the assumptions that people have. Not be aggressive about it, but just challenge it. Just to say, are you really sure you actually can think that? Do you really have a basis for assuming that? And I think that's one of the things we have to also be able to achieve. You have someone like Trump, being disrespectful about places like Africa, and nobody could actually challenge him on that level. That was astonishing. And I think it's because that has gone on for so long. The unchallenging has gone on for so long that people assume that they have a right to think like that. So it's also our responsibility, I think. We have to do what we have to do, but we also have to challenge the assumptions of the world.
Yeah, that I'm gonna remember that forever, what you just said about the characters whose childhood you have to be able to imagine. I mean, that is such a clear and excellent way to talk about like the empathy that's required in really entering and going up, like you said, into these other spaces. I think that's a problem. I think like with Trump, you know, he'll say these things about all sorts of places. He'll say things like China virus, all this stuff. And, you know, he can't imagine these people. He can't imagine their selfhoods. And so that's incredible. Well, there's one last really very poetic question here too that has a really lovely weight. It's pretty appropriate to say for last. Susan asks, if we should all pray, as you said, who should we pray to? And what should we expect to happen?
Well, pray to. I mean, people have a very limited idea of what prayer is. You know, people think prayer is going on your knees and putting your palm together and praying to a deity. There's so many different ways of praying. You know, looking deeply into the world is a kind of prayer. Having feeling for your fellow human being is a kind of prayer. Shaping something small and true is a kind of prayer. If you're a shopkeeper and people come into your shop and you attend to them with goodness of heart and help them, you know, how can I help you? That's the kind of prayer. For me, prayer is an act of communication with what's highest in us. It's an act of communication with what's deepest in us as human beings. Whether you see yourself as a spiritual being or whether you see yourself as an accumulation of matter, of cells, it really doesn't matter. Everybody feels within themselves something beyond definition. You know, you can pray to the God of humanity. You can pray to the collective spirit of the human. You can pray to the collective spirit of the living. You can tend your garden. Tending your garden is a kind of prayer. You know, making good work of any kind, going beyond the limit, going beyond what is expected, putting more into the depth of our discovery than is required. It's a very high kind of prayer, because what prayer does is it not only links and communicates, but it magnifies. It restores us to the fullness of our being. What is it that we should pray for? What is it we should ask for? That there be more love in the world, there be more understanding, that we actually, I'm going to take my glasses off, that we actually look deeply and truly at one another, because there's too much glance looking, there's too much glancing where you don't actually look at the person in front of you. And by looking, I mean not just looking with your eyes, I mean looking with your heart, as the little prince says, looking with your spirit, looking with your vulnerability, and looking with your strength. Yeah.
There's a beautiful, I feel like the end of this book has a sort of prayer-like poem, right? At the end. Did you want to perhaps read this at all?
Yeah, I'd love to. Did you say, would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to.
I'd love to, but how about we read it together so that folks get the conjoining of our voices. So how about you start by reading the first verse, I'll read the next one, and we'll do it like that. Yeah?
Okay, great. All right.
First of all, it's called All We Do, and it's the last poem. It's a poem, the last thing, last text at the end of the book, and it's meant to not summarize the book in any way, but to open it.
Really fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, we do.
A woman is reading a book in a landscape shaped by history. The hill rakes the gray horizon. All we do is story.
Private acts are dramas. Our public acts are dreams. Submerged rivers are thoughts. Our hopes are misted streams.
Beyond form, our souls breathe. Within form, our souls sing. Mystery belongs to being. Story belongs to the living.
Within this slice of eternity, we yield to time our story making sense. Awake in dreams, we live out myths. It's what makes us immense.
I love that. It's such a wonderful note for this book, which I really, really, really cannot emphasize enough for this group, everybody who's out here. I hope we can put this, you know, on YouTube or whatever, because I really want people to hear what you've said. This is a real masterclass in being a writer, on top of a masterclass in being a human being. And I think this book operates this way too. So it's a tremendous honor to come on board with this with you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Porochista, for your great spirit and your
honor
and your art, and especially the art of conversation, which is sorely needed in our times.
Oh yeah, it's so missed. It's such a joy to be able to do this. And thank you, Greenlight, for giving us this opportunity.
Greenlight and Akashic, thank you both very much.
And the questions. I've never had an event with such good questions. You're the best reader in the world. So thank you for those good questions. Oh.
Bless you all. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
See you soon when the pandemic is over.
Yes, please.
Thanks again, Ben and Porochista. I just want to mention we've dropped the buy link in the chat once again. Prayer for the Living, this wonderful, wonderful book is available from Greenlight Bookstore, thanks to Akashic Books. We will post the recording on YouTube within the next couple of days, so take a look at Greenlight Bookstore's YouTube channel. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We'll see you soon.
Bless. Bye-bye.